unassuming Saturday where we kick up our training shoes and stick on our sandals. I'm Shifu Pei, and when it comes to ancient Egyptian dynasties, few probably hold the amount of weight and impact as one particular dynasty. And that is because it could probably be considered the last great dynasty of Egypt.
What you first need to understand about Egypt is that its history is long. Like, really long. By the end of Egypt's first dynasty, Greece was being settled on by Indo-Europeans, which started the Mycenaean Greek period, making Egypt older than the very concept of the ancient Greece we know.
Now, most of you probably already know about the last great pharaoh of ancient Egypt, with Cleopatra VII, a person that almost certainly deserves a video of her own. But for today, our focus is on her ancestors and the hot mess that they were. Now, while it would be easy to just rattle off each member of the Ptolemaic dynasty in a bullet point Wikipedia style article, that would also be extremely boring and extremely flat, so we are not doing that. Instead, we're going to be looking at this in broad strokes and take a look at the Ptolemaic dynasty politically, socially, and economically, and try to unravel and understand why this was the last great dynasty of ancient Egypt. And to do that, we're going to need to look at this in more than just one video, starting with what is called the Golden Age of the Ptolemaic dynasty.
Our story goes all the way back to roughly 336 BC. Before we can truly delve into the start of the Ptolemaic dynasty, we need to look at the end of the previous one. Egypt at this time was not in the best of places, as it was in the middle of another invasion. This time from the Persians. But for the first time, Persian king Darius took the throne of Egypt, crowned Darius III. He unfortunately would not be able to get too comfortable. The Persians were well aware of both Sparta and Athens. Both of them were persistent nuisances to the Persians, and had been playing tug-of-war for control of the Aegean and Anatolia for some time. But what came as a surprise was a new up-and-coming king from the north, and his name is Alexander!
Is that too old a reference? Am I old?
The next few years saw Alex lead a campaign through the Hellespont into Western Persia, Anatolia, Cilicia, and eventually into Egypt, curb-stomping Darius and having Egyptian forces favour the clearly winning side. Cut to 325 BC, where Alexander the Above Average killed over and died 10 minutes after conquering everything in a 300-mile radius. His generals all took the opportunity to carve out something for themselves and get their cut, which included a certain general named, surprise surprise, Ptolemy. Now, Alexander, having been smart enough to not disrupt the already existing systems in place within Egypt, had stated himself to be a god and took on the role of pharaoh, which Ptolemy also saw advantage in.
Now, obviously it would have been kind of awkward to have a new god be announced dead after a weekend, so Ptolemy I did not officially make himself pharaoh until about 304 BC.
Under the reigns of the first three Ptolemies, Egypt thrived under a golden age, with key political alliances being established by Ptolemy I, which prevented invasion, an alliance which fortunately lasted for the next 2.5 centuries. There was also an expansion of the islands of Cyprus and Cyrene, and subsequently the conquering of southern and western Anatolia under Ptolemy II, and control of the Aegean coast under Ptolemy III. These alliances aided not only in preventing invasion and the greater power against warfare, but it also aided in the main source of income for Egypt: trade. The Suez Canal was opened, which allowed trade to India, camel trains allowed trading to Arabia, and boating via the Nile to the sub-Saharan, all of which made Egypt the cultural hub for trading at a global level.
There was also a push for academia in this new crown jewel of ancient Egypt, as we get to the holy grail for historians, the Library of Alexandria.
This pinnacle of knowledge and repository for sources. What was the motivation behind this seminal element? Bragging rights. Ptolemy I was a braggy boy and wanted to kick Athens off their intellectual throne as top learning place. Academies for scholars to learn and debate were constructed, paid wages to scholars and free reign to do as pleased direct from the royal treasury, museums with all necessities for the average scholar, dining areas, quiet areas, and of course, a library. This library was stocked to the eyeballs with reading material, sources, and references across the ancient world. It wasn't just the goal to get copies of these works either. Originals were also in demand. It was a frequent habit of Ptolemy III, in fact, to basically steal these works, as he would offer to borrow borrowed the books and works from Athenian libraries in exchange for a small deposit. And once the works arrived safely, he would message the library saying, basically, keep the pennies, I'm keeping the books.
I'm not gonna lie, I would too.
But here is where we find the nugget of a disparaging wrinkle in this golden age. And that is immigration and integration. See, while Alexander and Ptolemy I had the sense to not disrupt the culture of Egypt too much and instead try to gently add to what already existed with the introduction of the city of Alexandria, the integration of Greek immigrants into Egypt created more friction on a cultural level. An indication was the celebration of Egypt's trading wealth under Ptolemy II with a parade of gods. But not the native Egyptian gods, no sir, but instead with Zeus, Dionysus, Alexander the promoted to godhood, and Ptolemy I, along with his wife Dynasty. Not to mention the Temple of Poseidon and the Greek building system of a grid-based construction plan in inland Alexandria. But there was still a mixture of both Greek and Egyptian architecture in design, making it seem as though the two cultures could coexist. As this was ultimately the goal of Alexander in the beginning, to build a utopian society where Egyptian and Greek culture could coexist.
I mean, how difficult is it really? Respect both cultures, know where to collaborate and where to keep traditions alive, have the free transmission of ideas, and boom, coexistence! But as I'm sure you can probably guess, things were not as smooth as that. But that's going to be reserved for the next time we take a look at the Ptolemaic dynasty. For today, with the golden age of the Ptolemaic dynasty, what are we left with?
What could surprisingly have been a stable and workable system of government and sociability if the Ptolemies had been smart enough to leave goodwill alone. Alexander and Ptolemy I had the right idea in not overpowering the already in place systems that had already been in place for 2,000 years, but as time went on, the cracks started to show, as Ptolemy II got carried away and placed emphasis more so on the Greek side of culture, while Egyptian was left a pity mention. This will get cranked up to 11 as time goes on, but for now, it's a sour note.
But while it's easy to say that the downhill is coming and just leave it at that, we have to also acknowledge the good that came out of this golden age.
The introduction of the Library of Alexandria, theft notwithstanding, gave scholars like Plato, Euclid, Archimedes, and Aristarchus the space to expand and expound their knowledge to anyone who would listen, and those that did not want them to. The impact of trading on the Egyptian economy also cannot be ignored. The allowance for alliance and open trade to other continents led to greater wealth and opportunity for the Egyptian population.
But how does it all go wrong? Find out next time in the Ptolemaic Saga. Thank you for watching this week's video, and in the comments let me know if you could travel to any ancient society, any at all, where would you go and what would you do? Again, thank you all for watching, and until next time everyone, peace be with you. Welcome to Subing Saturday, where we kick off our training shoes and have great monuments built in our honour. One which I envisioned a little to the left. I'm Shifu Payne, and last year we took a gander at what is widely considered to be the last great dynasty of ancient Egypt. One that, after several ups and downs, created one of the most well-known monarchs in history with Cleopatra. But also, towards the beginning, represented a utopia, a coming together of two great civilizations. One which aimed to benefit the collective population as a whole. But as we'll move on to Ptolemy's IV through VIII, we'll begin to see not only the cracks begin to show, but also how those cracks became real weaknesses. What do I mean by that? Let's find out. First, let's settle back in by establishing where we left Egypt in our last video.
The economy was booming due to trade and commerce. The installation of the Library of Alexandria gave rise to a community of scholars and free thinkers who had free rein to learn and debate at their leisure. More and more immigrants from Greece came to Egypt, which unfortunately placed more and more of an emphasis on Greek communities than the native Egyptian. Even though the Ptolemies bore the title of Pharaoh, parades touting Greek gods, including Alexander the "oh hey, he's a god now," and the general ignorance of Egyptian culture, left a sour taste in the mouth of a respective Egyptian citizen. New economic policies, including the conversion of any free land into farming and wheat fields, intermediaries being used to collect revenue, plus any excuse to increase taxes for the humble native Egyptian, left much to be desired.
You see, tax hikes never work. Just ask King John. or Charles I, or Boris Johnson.
All of which came to a crescendo when, in 217 BCE, Ptolemy IV recruited native Egyptians to fight the Battle of Raphia as part of the Second Syrian War, which broke away from the convention of using Greek soldiers. Ptolemy stood, addressing his troops before the Battle of Raphia, fully in pharaoh attire and all the trimmings of a true ruler of Egypt. But with a translator present, as Ptolemy did not speak Egyptian. The sentiment among Egyptians was clear. They were fighting as the arrow fodder of someone who did not even respect their language.
Hanson, this is what happens when you miss your Duolingo lesson.
And so, when the battle was over and over 20,000 trained and armed Egyptians saw an opportunity, they took it. As looting and anarchy became the new norm, civilians became bandits and roamers throughout the Delta, raiding and pillaging the Greek garrison and Egyptian temples, both symbols of tyranny. Despite the offer of aid from the Macedonian and Seleucid kings, Lower Egypt in the north,
it's confusing, I know,
became a site of civil war in only a few short years. Meanwhile, further south in Thebes, tensions were also growing as a result of being so far from Alexandria, where Ptolemy IV spent most, if not all, of his time. Clearly, the needs of Upper Egypt were not a priority. Sensing the growing tension, Ptolemy IV had a Temple of Horus commissioned in Geba, but this did not help in the slightest. The authority of this invasive and not native pharaoh became weaker and weaker, to the point where many cried for a change of power, with a leader that was Egyptian by blood, a cry which was answered in the form of Horwenefer, who became officially recognized as pharaoh by the priesthood of Amun in 205, and began his reign by abolishing the hated tax regimes, forcing Greeks from their homes, and destroying land records. Upper and Lower Egypt were under the control of two pharaohs, making the people who lived in the border understandably confused. But when Ptolemy V came to power in 200 BCE at the age of 4, a counter-offensive was launched, recapturing cities as they pressed on to Thebes. Things went from bad to worse when Horwenefer passed away in 199 BCE, but his successor Ankh-Wenefer had a plan. They would target Sauti, a province 190 miles away from the recaptured Thebes, which supplied the rural economy for Thebes, cutting Thebes and the troops occupying it from supplies and communication from Alexandria, a gambit which paid off, as Ptolemaic forces abandoned Thebes, allowing Ankh-Wenefer to take it back. Finally sick of this shit, Ptolemy V made a plan to attack the Delta rebel headquarters directly, overpowering the rebels with their well-funded firepower. Finally, the rebels of the Delta were brought to Memphis and executed in 196 BCE during the coronation of Ptolemy V, an event which was commemorated in 3 written dialects: hieroglyphics, Greek, and Demotic, on what is now known to us as the Rosetta Stone.
Once this was over, the next step was to get rid of this people's pharaoh and bring back the wheat and tax profits. Instead of, listening to the voices of the collective native population and maybe working to strengthen the population as a whole. I mean, it's not like civil wars have ever led to problems on the international level, right?
Forces of Ankh-Wenefer were driven from Sauti before Ankh-Wenefer himself was driven from Thebes himself. In 191 BCE, driven to the Nubian border, Thebes was back in control of the Ptolemies. Land was auctioned off, taxes were back on, and all that was left was to capture Ankh-Wenefer himself. Despite help from Nubian forces, the would-be pharaoh was captured in 186, but not killed, as it would have made a martyr out of the rebel leader. With this came more military presence in Upper Egypt, lavish spending on temples including the now completed Geba temple to Horus, military camps placed in key areas, public torture and execution of rebel members, and all in all just another day in the office. But despite this reclamation, there was still trouble. The discourse of these rebellions, coupled with trouble within the royal family, plus weakened economic standing, left the Ptolemies in dire straits. By Ptolemy V's passing in 180 BCE, Syria, Anatolia, and Thrace were out of their control, and the Hellenistic Mediterranean was crumbling, making a way for big boy Rome to step in. What was a dynasty to do?
Well, I'll tell you, marry their sister!
Ptolemy VI became pharaoh while still in nappies, so his mother acted as regent until she died 4 years later. With Ptolemy VI having not even gone through puberty yet, it was forced by the other members of government to have a tri-rule. That is, 3 siblings working together as joint monarchs: Ptolemy VI, Ptolemy VIII, and their sister, / the wife of Ptolemy VI.
Now, as anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together could tell you, having 3 siblings occupying the throne of one country, yeah, that's not a good idea.
With different priorities, rivalries, and Ptolemy VIII stealing Ptolemy VI's teddy, except not that last one, things were going from bad to worse. When the Seleucids, led by Antiochus, took over Egypt, deposed the Ptolemies, stole their blankie, and that was the end of that.
But not for long!
Because Rome, remember them? You should, they're kind of important, stepped in and sent Antiochus packing. moving in themselves as the new stepdad of Ptolemaic Egypt, having to continually make peace between the siblings until their fighting grew so bad the people had enough and started another rebellion. Yes, in 165 BCE, the revolts of Thebes began again, despite Ptolemy VI's frankly pathetic attempts to ask them nicely to stop, which did not work. And Ptolemy ran to Rome to go into exile. Ptolemy VIII fared no better, acting with such an iron fist that people wanted his brother back.
I know!
But Ptolemy VIII, after attempts on his life, had a plan. He made a will, stipulating that if he died with no heir, Egypt would fall under the control of Rome, which made everyone pack it in very quickly, as an Egypt controlled by a foreign king was one thing, but under the thumb of an expanding empire, clearly too far. Ptolemy VI died in 165, making Ptolemy VIII the official ruler of Egypt, with stepdad Rome by his side. Unfortunately, Ptolemy in the process gave away more Egyptian independence by handing more responsibilities to Rome, signing the death sentence of Egypt right before the eyes of history. I mean, speaking as someone who's had to live through several historical events in the past few years, not a good sign, buddy. Having secured his position, married his sister, had a kid, Ptolemy VIII began to get the people of Egypt on his side, by bribery in the case of the priesthoods, or in the case of fear, and then in 140 married his sister's daughter.
So his niece/daughter.
Causing mother and daughter to become rivals.
And, again, disgusting.
Civil war then broke out between the two, and Ptolemy VIII fled to Cyprus with his daughter/niece/wife. But, fearing that his son by his sister/wife would be pronounced Pharaoh in his absence, had his son killed, and the pieces sent back to his mother. Despite this clear atrocity, the people were still on Ptolemy's side, and supported him in the reclaiming of his kingdom, especially after promising native Egyptians offices in government, something not done for 2 centuries. The jewel of his nation, Alexandria, was recaptured, and the people swam in the decadence of their country, becoming more and more like their monarch by the day. Once back in power, Ptolemy had his opponents trapped and burned alive. Such ruthless action, while sending a message to any other would-be opposers, only accelerated the Ptolemaic decline. Come 116 BCE, Ptolemy VIII passed, leaving 2 sons behind him, a tattered reputation, a people based in fear and duplicity, and an enemy invited in. For at the same time of Ptolemy VIII's passing, a group of Romans visited Philae and the temple to Isis, and left an inscription of their names, in Latin, on the temple walls, a sign of the future. It was the beginning of the end for the last great dynasty of Egypt.
So there we have it, and after looking at all of this and considering where we are, it really does seem that Ptolemaic Egypt really did sign its own death sentence. I mean, ignoring the needs of its people, allowing an encroaching empire to gain more independence and control of a country, and taking actions which, while cathartic over time, only exasperated the already existing issues. And when you consider how Ptolemy I started all of this, as a utopia, as a hopeful bastion of knowledge and of 2 great civilizations coming together, sharing knowledge and creating a haven for scholars, while also honouring the culture that already existed. And when you just see how their descendants just mucked it all up and just took for granted what they had handed to them, yeah, it kind of makes you want to see everything collapse, doesn't it? But I guess all of that will just have to wait until next time. Thank you for watching this week's video, and in the comments let me know what your take on all of this is and what you think the greatest fatal flaw was in Ptolemaic Egypt. Where did it all go wrong? What was the thing which truly broke the camel's back? Or was it the straw that broke the camel's back, or something like that? But with that, thank you all for watching, and until next time everyone, peace be with you. While I would like to say that today's video is only for the purposes of entertainment, I cannot. This video carries a stark reminder of the consequences of stepping aside. We live in a world today where our children are mutilated, where rights are taken away as easily as a brushstroke. The minds of the masses are subjected to daily conditioning. This is a prison, made at the culmination of bad choices. But it is not too late to start making good choices. Let today's video and today's guide into history serve as a reminder of what kind of life and what kind of future you wish to build?
The dynasty of the Ptolemies began as the bringing together of two cultures. Alexandria was the pinnacle of one man's dream, a dream which quickly became a nightmare, as his descendants prioritized their own wants over the needs of their people. The country was split down the middle in civil war. More and more power was given to a foreign nation, as the ones on the throne became more and more inadequate. Many died in war and famine. Taxes soared, families became divided, and the people, who were blinded by the decadence of glory and pride, cheered all of this.
How does this all move forward? Well, it certainly does, but not quite upwards, more downwards.
Let us start by looking again at the Temple of Horus in Geba. The temple was not officially consecrated until 70 BCE, more than 167 years after the foundations were consecrated by Ptolemy III.
Was this a form of appeasement to the Egyptian culture from a Greek and out-of-touch royal family? A sort of peace offering? Or was it a relic of a dream that one general had to bring together two cultures in peace?
While Ptolemy VI and VIII had rivaled for the throne, and then Ptolemy VIII's two wives had split the country in two, the people had been stuck in the middle, just trying to keep their lives together. Trying to make a living during a time where enemies seemed to be on the throne and at the door, as Rome was fully at the age of expansion. The Ptolemaic territory of Cyrenaica fell into Roman territory 75 BC, leaving only Cyprus as the last Ptolemaic territory. Not that the pharaohs cared much. After the passing of Ptolemy VIII, his second wife, Cleopatra III, was made ruler of Egypt, and was asked to make one of Ptolemy's two sons regent until they were ready to rule alone. She chose Ptolemy IX.
And while it was meant to be just the easy transition of power, it was anything but.
Ptolemy IX and Ptolemy X fought for the throne following Ptolemy IX's removal and Ptolemy X's subsequent ascent. Ptolemy IX had greater allies than X, so in desperation, Ptolemy turned to Rome for military support. This was not so much a deal with the devil, but instead the final nail after what Ptolemy VIII had done to give power to Rome. But even with this power, military support was not Rome's only interest.
When someone was being invaded by Rome, there were two choices available to them. Either they could stand against Rome with their dignity intact, but ultimately most likely be crushed under Rome's sheer mass. Or they could stand aside, let their dignity and their country be enslaved to the Roman Empire. Ptolemy X chose the latter, and thought it the lesser of two evils. Would you agree?
Rome quickly saw an opportunity and made Egypt's Nile Valley a hub for exportation. To reflect, Egypt had, in just the span of a century, gone from the head of a dynasty to just another chip for Rome to bet with. Ptolemy XII followed suit in this pathetic headspace. He had the habit of showing himself in the pageantry of a god, calling himself the new Dionysus or the young Osiris, a fact which is laughable when looking at the country he ruled. Rather than a thriving economy through harvest or trade, the country was in continual debt to Rome. For example, when Pompey the Great conquered the Seleucid kingdom, Ptolemy attempted to garner favour, giving 8,000 men to Pompey's ranks, and funded Pompey's invasion of Palestine by emptying the royal treasury, forcing tax rises, and cutting into public expenditure. The result of this, on the home front, was a revolt from the Egyptian people, who had lived through generations of hard times and had enough of Rome and everything associated with it. Ptolemy asked for help to quell the revolt, and Rome gave none. If this man could not even run his country stably, how could he be expected to be taken seriously by anyone, let alone Rome? Soon Julius Caesar entered the stage, with Ptolemy hearing that Caesar would raise the question of Egypt in the Roman Senate in 59 BCE. Ptolemy tried to pay him off by giving half of Egypt's revenue in exchange for recognition as Egypt's king and a friend to Rome.
A king does not ask, he tells.
What was Ptolemy's reward? Cyprus was taken by Rome less than a year later, and his brother was driven to suicide. All the while, Ptolemy kept quiet. But the people did not. They drove Ptolemy XII into exile, and his oldest daughter, Berenice, became queen in her father's place. The first place Ptolemy went to while in exile was Rhodes, to speak to the Roman magistrate, who was at the time on the bog having taken a laxative. To think, the Pharaoh, the living incarnation of Ra, who had crushed kingdoms underfoot, now pleaded to a mid-level politician with a bad case of the tum-tums. Apparently, Ptolemy said enough, and sold enough of his dignity to return 55 BCE with an army loaned from Gabinius, the governor of Syria. Ptolemy had his oldest daughter, who actually had a backbone against Rome and had been running the country competently, executed, and Egypt was named as the provincial branch of Rome's central bank.
Selling his country, his people, his daughter, and himself for a nice hat and a fancy chair.
By this point, Ptolemy knew that the writing was on the wall, and his days were numbered. Did he suspect that he was about to be supplanted by Rome, or that his people would revolt again? Either was possible, so he partook in some image upkeep, and commissioned a temple to Hathor in Lunete in 54 BCE, before he made his younger daughter his regent in 52 BCE to secure his position, obviously not wanting a repeat of the power struggle there had been previously, not too soon it seems, as Ptolemy XII died a year later, leaving his daughter as the new monarch of Egypt. What was her name? Cleopatra.
What follows is the reign of one of the most famous, or infamous, monarchs to exist in history, with just as much fiction around her as there is fact. Yet we can already say, after looking at her ancestors and what she had to inherit from her own father, it is quite impressive that she was able to be at least a competent ruler and keep her head above water. We will look at this all in detail when the time comes, but until then, thank you all for watching, and until next time, peace be with you. And so it ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. The time of the last great dynasty of ancient Egypt was anything but golden, although it certainly tried to start that way.
When Alexander's general became king of Egypt, his goal was to create a union between two cultures, to see them both aid each other to become a utopia, but his descendants were negligent in their duties, favouring the Greek segments of the populace and not bothering to ingratiate into the Egyptian culture, leading to rebellion after rebellion, civil war and economic strife, until eventually Rome arrived on the scene. More and more control was given to Rome as Pharaoh sought to appease the empire, bending over backwards and bankrupting the country in order to kiss ass, until Ptolemy XII gave way to Rome almost entirely, sacrificing his daughter in the process to reclaim a throne which he had been ousted from. When in March 51 BC, Ptolemy XII passed, he was succeeded by his daughter, the 17-year-old Cleopatra.
First, let's go ahead and try and dispel a couple of myths that are circulating Cleopatra, as after about 2,000 years, give or take, inevitably there are ones that are going to crop up.
Cleopatra was a smart cookie, with a royal education, access to the Library of Alexandria, classical writings that have survived today, plus ones which did not, being able to speak multiple languages including Egyptian, and a great capacity for rhetoric. All of this combined made her an ideal ruler along with her genuine love for Egypt, her home. And it was a good thing she was so cunning, as this was most likely what made her attractive. Cleo was less the exotic beauty film would portray her as, and more of a 5 by today's standards, perhaps a high 6, but her intelligence coupled with her status probably made her quite the catch, as well as an important ally. Although you would not think that at first, Ptolemy XII's last will and testament stipulated that Cleo had to co-rule with her then 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII.
A risky stipulation given the history of this era, but fair enough.
Seeing as how Ptolemy was a prepubescent ruler, it was easy for his big sister to sideline him and rule Egypt alone for the first 18 months.
But things went well, until they didn't.
A series of disasters, including an unusually low inundation which led to crop failure and low food yields. If not for emergency legislation, Egypt would have fallen to famine. Less than 2 years into her reign, and it already looked as though the gods of Egypt had abandoned the new queen. Not good. Public opinion soon began to sway in favour of Ptolemy XIII. While this was going on, a civil war was underway in Rome, as Pompey and Caesar vied for control. Cleopatra sided Pompey due to his ally Gabinius aiding her father to retake the throne. And while she did this, it seems that history would repeat itself, as like her father before her, Cleopatra was exiled from Egypt in 48 BCE. But unlike her father, Cleo went not to Rome for support but closer to home, as she went to Palestine, who were still loyal to her, with the two opposing armies of Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII facing against each other at the eastern Nile Delta. By this point, Ptolemy XIII had gained recognition by Rome, and so was confident of his victory, which led to recklessness when Pompey began to head for Egypt, having been defeated in Greece. As soon as Pompey the Great arrived in Alexandria's harbour side, Ptolemy had him killed. If Ptolemy thought that this would earn him points with Caesar, this was obviously before anyone had heard of kill stealing. 4 days later, when Caesar did arrive, he immediately took residence in the royal palace, and enacted the ultimate power move of summoning the pharaoh into his own throne room in his palace in his country.
I think it's safe to say that Ptolemy royally misread the situation.
Now, what kind of cunning queen would Cleopatra have been if she let an opportunity such as this one pass by, smuggling her way into Alexandria and into the royal palace to have a private audience with the now ruler of Rome? And we all know what happened next. The nose met the crown, Caesar's palace laid down dough, Egyptian wiles whiled the time away. To think Caesar was in his 50s at this point and Cleo was 21.
And to think people complain today about a 10-year age difference. Or even a 5-year age difference.
Caesar threw his full support of Rome behind Cleopatra's claim to the throne, which was when Ptolemy had his forces raise the royal palace. Rome's army provided support, and when the dust had settled, a lot had happened. Ptolemy was dead, having drowned in the Nile. Cleopatra was queen once more. Her younger sister Arsinoe, who had briefly been named queen, was deported to Italy, and her younger brother Ptolemy XIV was named co-regent.
Oh, and the pending ship name of Systra had a bun in the oven.
The union between Egypt and Rome was solidified as Cyprus was gifted back to Egypt, but there was an increased military presence in Egypt, making it clear what would happen if the country did not toe the line, finally codified by the birth of Ptolemy Caesar, or Caesarion, in 47 BCE. The birth of her son led to great commemoration, with special coins from the royal mint, as well as religious commissions, starting with a roof shrine for the temple of the mother goddess Hathor at Ionet, as well as a birthing house at Ioni, with the next action being most significant, as the worship of Isis was promoted in the most prominent Greek cities of Alexandria and Ptolemaic. Isis was the divine mother and protector of her son Horus. Cleo held a great affinity for her and began to have statues commissioned, which blended the two's likenesses. The two became one in a very Egyptian initiative,
with the reasons behind going for the affinity being quite obvious when you consider how next to Ra or Horus, Isis was one of the most powerful deities in the Egyptian pantheon.
Following this, Cleopatra visited Rome at the invitation of Caesar in 46, staying with him in Tabar for 2 years. Caesar followed suit with the godly propaganda, dedicating a statue to Cleopatra as Venus Genetrix, a goddess commonly syncretized with Isis.
So clearly the two were on the same papyrus.
Unfortunately, trouble brewed when Caesar moved in the Senate for permission to marry and have children with a non-Roman woman. Kind of late for that, isn't it? This crystallized Rome's worst fears, that their ruler had gone native. Cut to 44 BCE, where Caesar did the dying and Brutus did the stabbing. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria with her lover and her brother dead.
Oh no! Anyway.
Cleo had her son made her co-regent as Ptolemy XV, and elevated the religious propaganda. Her Osiris was murdered, her Horus was elevated. In a sort of tragic way, things were going according to plan.
Until the other gods of Egypt had other ideas.
Between 43 and 41 BCE, another series of low inundations led to nation-spread food shortages, with this causing many to lose faith in any sort of religion, especially in afterlife. Perhaps not the best time to be a queen modelling oneself after a prominent deity. This compounded with the imminent problem that now that Caesar was gone, so was his protection, making it only a matter of time before a would-be conqueror would come knocking on Egypt's door. Compounding stress was the release of Arsinoe from Rome to Ephesus, who became a rallying point for dissenters against Cleopatra's rule. These problems needed serious work to fix.
See, if only there was a way to expedite the solving of at least some of these problems.
Mark Antony, Cassius, and Octavian all called upon Egypt for military support for their claim to Rome. Cleopatra read the situation and decided to side with Caesar's mentee, Mark Antony. Antony would end up defeating Cassius and Brutus at the Battle of Philippi.
So it seems that once again we have another high-profile Roman who has come into power, and at the same time as when Egypt needs protection. I think we can all see where this is going.
In 41 BCE, Mark Antony arranged to meet with Cleopatra at Tarsus. Mark wanted to go from his victory at Philippi to then take on the last major threat to Rome, the Parthian Empire. To do this, he required a military base in the Mediterranean. Egypt suited the bill. He most likely expected some royal pageantry before getting into brass tacks with a fellow ruler, but probably was not expecting what greeted him. Cleopatra fully in royal procession, deific regalia to the nines, the living incarnation of Isis and Venus, coming now to meet her Dionysus. To say that his eye was caught would be an understatement, I'm sure. The two reached an agreement before proceeding to Alexandria to do some baking. 9 months later, and Cleo gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. But unfortunately, even queens are not immune to being a pump and dump, as Antony soon returned to Rome seeking assistance from Octavian, his former rival, on the Parthia, securing this aid by marrying his sister Octavia. But despite this heartbreak, Egypt began to improve, with more crop inundation and agriculture over the next 3 years, doing very well financially if not for Ptolemy XII's legacy of debt. But as ever, things would change once again. By 37 BCE, Mark realised that Octavian would be no help, and so returned to Egypt, attempting to sweeten the deal by giving the contents of the Great Library of Kings of Pergamon to Cleopatra, as well as the Roman territories of the Eastern Mediterranean, a gift which would make Cleo an imperialist ruler much like her ancestors. A shame it was a ruse, as Antony could not give her these territories, just fake deeds and a bunch of books in exchange for real money and armies.
It is debatable just what their relationship was. Obviously there was a certain amount of lust and passion involved, but was Antony using Cleopatra? Was Cleo using Antony? Were they using each other? Well, I don't know, I wasn't there.
With this support in hand, the first Parthian campaign was underway, and failed spectacularly, with the only saving grace being the birth of another child with Ptolemy Philadelphus. But in 34 BCE, the second campaign was underway. This time, Cleo joined Antony at the banks of Euphrates, and they had a limited victory in Armenia. This was obviously the time for a huge celebration with the donations of Alexandria, as all of their children were gifted territories of the eastern province of Rome, including some territories at the time unconquered. An audacious and bold thing to do, putting Cleopatra and Egypt on Rome's crosshairs. Mark Antony and Octavian soon began to rival each other once again, with Antony having the eastern provinces and alliances in the Senate on his side, while Octavian was the legal heir to Caesar, as he was his great-nephew. Things continued to escalate until civil war broke out. Cleopatra, as Antony's ally, was also tied to this war, but Octavian was able to use this for propaganda, stating that while he was the true Roman out of the two, Antony had allied himself with a foreign nation and become a traitor. As the war continued to escalate, the party left Alexandria and eventually landed at Athens, with Mark officially breaking his marriage with Octavia. By 31 BCE, formal warfare officially broke out, and it was soon becoming clear that Mark Antony's ambition was greater than his ability, as his armadas were quickly pinned and blockaded, and by the time of the Battle of Actium, all that could be done was to retreat, with Cleopatra sailing back to Alexandria, while Antony went to Libya to rendezvous later. The writing was on the wall, and they both knew it. But if you have to go, then go with style, as when Antony returned a few days later, a massive festival and celebration was held, celebrating the coming of age of Ptolemy Caesar. This could only do so much, however, as Cleo began to prepare, having her naval fleet move from the Nile to the Red Sea. Caesarion sailed to India, and Cleopatra, trapped in her home country, chose to send a final word to Octavian, offering to abdicate in favour of her children, if Egypt was therefore spared what was to come. If Octavian received this message, he did not indicate it. In 30 BCE, Octavian's forces overran Alexandria by land and by sea. By this point, Antony was spent and out of options. Misinformed that his lover was dead, he made his final choice and fell upon the sword. Cleopatra heard of what happened, and although legend indicates she had his almost lifeless form brought to her to die, what we know is that she was barricaded within her treasury turned mausoleum, and eventually herself overrun and captured. In her lifetime, Cleopatra had seen either her family members killed or held in indentured servitude. She decided that death would be preferable. Although legend paints the picture of her using an asp or a poisoned comb, it's far more likely she used just regular poison. Her eldest son, Caesarion, the son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, was found a few short days later and killed.
And so the sun did set on the pharaohs. Egypt would continue to pass from ruler to ruler, from tyrant to warlord, before finally gaining independence. It is quite amazing to think that over 2,000 years worth of history, an entire civilization, could just rise and fall due to one succession of kings. Say what you will about Cleopatra, but this series does clearly showcase that she was dealt a bad hand by all of the inadequacies of her ancestors, most especially by her father. Now, to be clear, Cleopatra did make her own mistakes, certainly, but it seemed as though it all was kind of inevitable by the end. Now keep in mind, this was all before the fall of Pompeii in 79 AD. The fall of ancient Egypt could be considered as less a series of dominoes falling and more sort of the inevitable changing of the tide. The old world falling to the new. Egypt could not compare to Rome. It was just too big. It was even too big to sustain itself after a while. One can't help but compare all of this to the world that we live in today, we have created a science and technology-based house of cards, one that is full of intricate systems and very delicate designs. And just look at how quickly all of those crumbled away only a few short years ago. So the only question left to us is, where are we in this comparison? Are we Egypt, about to be crushed by the new? Are we Rome, about to collapse in on ourselves? About to eat ourselves alive due to abundance and unsustainability? But in either case, we cannot skim on our training, nor can we skim on our knowledge. So until next time, thank you all for watching, and peace be with you.